Welcome to 10 Minutes On, a podcast from the Joint Public Issues team. My name's Sienna. I'm a Joint Public Issues team intern. Joining me today is Steve Hucklesby. Steve is JPIT's policy advisor on international affairs, peace, security, arms, and climate change. Today, we'll be introducing this podcast series on the future of arms. We'll be talking to Steve about all of his experience working on disarmament and peace, and why, at JPIT, we believe that we need to be thinking about the future of arms today. So, Steve, let's jump right in. With so many pressing national and international concerns, why do you think that people should spend their time thinking about and engaging with developments in war and weapons technology?
Well, we're really pleased to be working with people on this because it's such a crucial area. Technology is going to change the way in which war is fought in the future. To some extent, we already see this happening in Ukraine. Many more Russian soldiers are killed compared to Ukrainians, and Zelensky puts the difference down to the presence of technology on the battlefield. It's not that Russia doesn't have good technology, it's got excellent electronic warfare, for example, but Ukraine has got this entire cottage industry of drone makers and of cyber weapons. We see this too in the Houthis' attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. Difficulty is that these technologies are not just there for United States, Britain and other advanced powers, but they are going to disseminate to many other groups as well. These new technologies in space, in cyber, in autonomous weapons, they're going to require us to ask new questions of ethics. So, for example, if there were to be an offensive cyber attack on the UK, is that an act of war or not? How do we respond? These are not merely academic questions, they're issues which are affecting people the world over today. But fortunately, the history of arms control suggests that when people come together and act on the basis of principle and are active with governments, we can influence and affect the developments of arms and the way in which they are used.
So what are your hopes if there are big issues around disarmament and around arms control that we really urgently need to consider and to make progress on in terms of international agreements on these issues? What are your hopes specifically for progress on arms control?
Well, we have seen big successes in recent years. For example, in the International Arms Trade Treaty or with the Convention on Cluster Munitions. The Cluster Munition Treaty, has it eliminated cluster munitions entirely? No, it hasn't. But the majority of the world's nations are either signatories now or have a moratorium on the use of cluster munitions. And this is because there is general recognition around the globe that using weapons that produce unexploded bomblets that lie around on the battlefield long after conflict has ended is something that is not acceptable today. So there is this taboo over cluster munitions that has only come about because members of churches and other concerned individuals around the world have said this is wrong.
That's really encouraging. As we look towards the future developments in arms and weapons technology, what are your major concerns?
In space, it is that it has become an awful lot easier and cheaper to put satellites into space, and so there's danger that these satellites are therefore having an impact on the battlefield below. We can see that in Ukraine, and so therefore there is an incentive maybe for governments to find ways of using missiles to take satellites out. Space up until now has been a field for cooperation and not for conflict, and we want to keep it that way. With autonomous weapons, or killer robots as they're known, the danger here is that there might be a military advantage in being able to have robots that can identify a human enemy and take them out without need of communication with an operator, because that communication link itself is quite vulnerable.
So essentially what we've seen is that civil society and actually decision makers have decided that on certain issues there are red lines that shouldn't be crossed. We've already mentioned that we're confronting new ethical concerns and new battlefields, such as weapons in space and whether or not robots should be able to take human life. What are the emerging red lines that you're particularly concerned about?
Well, from my point of view, if you give a robot a gun, I think immediately you have crossed a red line. I think we need to be clear on one point. These are not technologies of the future. These are technologies of today. So, for example, there is a Turkish drone which has been used in Libya and is being used on human forces there, and it is capable of autonomous operation, autonomous killing. As far as we know, when it was used in Libya, it wasn't used in that mode. But the problem is, if that is the case, that is, on that occasion, a decision that was made by a specific military force. There is no explicit piece of international law that would guide militaries in this respect, and this is where we need some development, and rather urgently.
How do you hope that people listening today, but also people who continue to engage with the Future of Arms project, what's your hope for what comes from that?
As Christians, I do think that we have a role in speaking up against the development of weapons, the enormous amounts of money that goes into development of new technologies for harm. At the moment, we have something like $2.4 trillion being spent across the world on armies and on weapons. This is money that is being siphoned off from tackling some of the key challenges that we need to tackle as a global community together. The UK government has an aspiration for the country to become a technology superpower. But as nations, we must ensure that we do everything we can to ensure that this technology is put to peaceful purposes and not to fuel a new global arms race. I would suggest that there's every evidence to suggest that when people come together around key principles and they become active with governments, we can be really effective in limiting what governments would otherwise do.
What would you like people who are engaging with these podcasts to be thinking about, praying about, and doing as they engage with this quite heavy topic?
There's a simple and straightforward level of engagement. We want people to be able to learn and to take action with their MPs. You don't have to be an expert in the field to know that we don't want robots deciding whether we are friend or foe and then taking action against us. We don't want space to become a new battlefield with all the costs that would entail. Let's celebrate the intelligence and ingenuity that God has given the human race. But intelligence is different from wisdom. We want our mental capacities to be put into developing technologies to solve the climate crisis, not into weapons of war that create further tensions between the major powers. And the Joint Public Issues team is going to be producing actions and resources for people so that we can engage with our MPs and with the UK government on this, and ask for the UK government to take a principled stance in international negotiations.
That's great.
Also at JPIT, we're going to be engaging with other Christians and with other faiths around the world, and we're going to be bringing their wisdom, their insights on these issues to the UK.
And I think actually as communities and as multiple faith communities, there's so much more that we can achieve together.
Yeah. All the major faiths have human dignity, the dignity of every human individual, as a core part of their faith systems. So when we come together to discuss and look at conflict, we're always going to see human conflict as a tragedy and not just as a challenge.
Thank you, Steve. As you say, there actually is stuff that we can be doing, and individually maybe it's really difficult for us to have an impact, but together we can do so much more, and each of us speaking up, but we become part of this wider dialogue, and actually each individual voice is a really important part of the collective in pushing forwards for more justice and for peace and a more peaceful future.
That's it for this episode of the 10 Minutes On podcast focused on the future of arms. If you'd like to find out more about advances in warfare, head to jpit.uk/FOA for briefings, blogs, videos, ways to take action, and more podcast episodes. That's jpit.uk/FOA. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do share it around. Thanks for listening.